Oxytocin is a neurohormone. It fine-tunes your brain's social instincts. It primes you to do things that strengthen close relationships. Oxytocin makes you crave physical contact with your friends and family. It enhances your empathy. It even makes you more willing to help and support the people you care about. Some people have even suggested we should snort oxytocin, right, to become more compassionate and caring. But here's what most people don't understand about oxytocin. It's a stress hormone. Your pituitary gland pumps this stuff out as part of the stress response. It's as much a part of your stress response as the adrenaline that makes your heart pound. And when oxytocin is released in the stress response, it is motivating you to seek support. Your biological stress response is nudging you to tell someone how you feel instead of bottling it up. Your stress response wants to make sure you notice when someone else in your life is struggling so that you can support each other. When life is difficult, your stress response wants you to be surrounded by people who care about you.
Let me start, if I may, with a little bit of history. The idea of strategy in business owes its origins to two intellectual giants, Bruce Henderson, the founder of BCG, and Michael Porter, professor at Harvard Business School. Henderson's central idea was what you might call the Napoleonic idea of concentrating mass against weakness, of overwhelming the enemy. What Henderson recognized was that in the business world, there are many phenomena which are characterized by what economists would call increasing returns, scale, experience. The more you do of something, disproportionately, the better you get. And therefore, he found a logic for investing in such kinds of overwhelming mass in order to achieve competitive advantage. And that was the first introduction of essentially a military concept of strategy into the business world. Porter agreed with that premise, but he qualified it. He pointed out correctly that that's all very well, but businesses actually have multiple steps to them. They have different components. And each of those components might be driven by a different kind of strategy. A company or a business might actually be advantaged in some activities, but disadvantaged in others. He formed the concept of the value chain, essentially the sequence of steps with which a, shall we say, raw material becomes a component, becomes assembled into a finished product, and then is distributed, for example. And he argued that advantage accrued to each of those components, and that the advantage of the whole was in some sense the sum or the average of that of its parts.
I coined my own definition of success, which is peace of mind attained only through self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to do the best of which you're capable. I believe that's true. If you make the effort to do the best of which you're capable, trying to improve the situation that exists for you, I think that's success, and I don't think others can judge that. I think it's like character and reputation. Your reputation is what you're perceived to be. Your character is what you really are, and I think the character is much more important than what you are perceived to be. You'd hope they'd both be good, but they don't necessarily be the same. Well, that was my idea of what I was going to try to get across to the youngsters. I ran across other things. I love to teach, and it was mentioned by the previous speaker that I enjoy poetry and I dabble in it a bit and love it. And there are some things that help me, I think, be better than I would have been. I know I'm not what I ought to be and not what I should be, but I think I'm better than I would have been if I hadn't run across certain things. And one was just a little verse that said, no written word, no spoken plea can teach our youth what they should be, nor all the books on all the shelves is what the teachers are themselves. That made an impression on me in the 1930s, and I tried to use that more or less in my teaching, whether it be in sports or whether it be in the English classroom.
#transcript. The point I'm trying to make is that when you're asleep, this thing doesn't shut down. In fact, some areas of the brain are actually more active during the sleep state than during the wake state. The other thing that's really important about sleep is that it doesn't arise from a single structure within the brain, but is to some extent a network property. If we flip the brain on its back, I love this little bit of spinal cord here. This bit here is the hypothalamus, and right under there is a whole raft of interesting structures, not least the biological clock. The biological clock tells us when it's good to be up, when it's good to be asleep, and what that structure does is interact with a whole raft of other areas within the hypothalamus, the lateral hypothalamus, the ventrolateral preoptic nuclei. All of those combine, and they send projections down to the brain stem here. The brain stem then projects forward and bathes the cortex, this wonderfully wrinkly bit over here, with neurotransmitters that keep us awake and essentially provide us with our consciousness. So sleep arises from a whole raft of different interactions within the brain, and essentially, sleep is turned on and off as a result of a range of interactions in here.
One of the social issues faced by the state of Alaska is the lack of mental and emotional well-being of the Native Alaskans. It is very unfortunate that many of the Native Americans are living under poor conditions throughout the country. In the cases of Native Alaskans, even virtually entire villages are suffering from a lack of mental and emotional well-being, which includes continuing poor physical and mental health. Alcohol abuse, domestic violence, homicides, and suicides are frequent among them, which of course, lead to families falling apart. It is tragic to see that many children are abused and not educated properly. As a matter of fact, the children themselves are abusing alcohol and other chemicals, and the rate is increasing over the time. Since parents are suffering from mental illnesses and alcohol abuse, they can't take care of their children, so many children are being taken care of by others or simply neglected. Therefore, we can conclude that Alaskan Natives are losing hold of their communities, cultural identities, and most importantly, their childhoods. So, you can see how serious the issue is. Plus, rather than making a living for themselves, they are depending on public services and subsidies. They have lost control of and responsibility for their economy and governing institutions. The Western countries' women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rates increased during 20th century, but it starts to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as an example, the birth rate remained at around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to its lowest point that has never been seen in the society. It also has impacts on male in the society, especially young man, and it might have some connection with unemployment rates as well. The milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. Firstly, it is very grand, which most especially later foundations aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded 900, 1000, even in one case 1200 years ago.
So we've known for decades that emissions are rising in the atmosphere because we can see them swirling up around there. So the famous Keeling curve is based on what we can actually see from space. But what you can't easily see from space is how did they get there? It still boggles my mind, but even in the year 2021, in most countries and most sectors of the economy, our process for actually answering where all those emissions coming from is still to ask polluters how much they polluted. Just kind of like hope nothing is missing in that inventory, and then add up all those numbers, sometimes manually on paper. It's amazing that every single country in the world has agreed to this process. It's one of the great things that brings me hope that everyone in the world is essentially contributing to this process. But it is such a stopgap solution. If we were really serious about stopping climate change, you can only manage what you can measure, and we need to have more information. We need to have information, not like letting it take years to compile manual reports. I mean, there are countries that haven't had an emissions inventory in 20 years. What are you actually supposed to do with information that old? We need to not just be looking at what are the emissions of entire countries, because if you want to know how to reduce them, you need to know, right, do I need to go after the cars? Do I need to go after factories? What in my country is driving all these emissions?
You see, camels are one of the only animals in the world that store all their fat in one spot. And that's useful for keeping cool in a hot climate, because heat can escape faster from the rest of their body, which helps them maintain a lower body temperature. Compare that to other mammals, like humans, who store fat all over, making it a lot harder to stay cool. Today, camels still use the fat in their humps as a food reserve, but they're not the only ones. In extreme circumstances, the Turkana tribe in Kenya, for example, will eat camel fat to survive.
They suffer a lot from periods of extreme drought. And I have seen these people, they've been very, very short of food. And this is difficult to believe, but it's true. Slit open the top of a camel's hump, take out the fat for their own consumption, and then put the top of the hump back on again.
But don't worry. The camel makes a full recovery, and instances are rare. But this practice has started to generate some buzz around camel fat as a new superfood. Turns out, camel fat is loaded with fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals.
I bet all of you are familiar with this view of the ocean. But the thing is, most of the ocean looks nothing like this. Below the sunlit surface waters, there's an otherworldly realm known as the Twilight Zone. At 200 to 1,000 meters below the surface, sunlight is barely a glimmer. Tiny particles swirl down through the darkness, while flashes of bioluminescence give us a clue that these waters teem with life. Microbes, plankton, fish, everything that lives here has amazing adaptations for the challenges of such an extreme environment. These animals help support top predators such as whales, tuna, swordfish, and sharks. There could be 10 times more fish biomass here than previously thought. In fact, maybe more than all the rest of the ocean combined. There are countless undiscovered species in deep waters, and life in the Twilight Zone is intertwined with Earth's climate. Yet the Twilight Zone is virtually unexplored. There are so many things we still don't know about it.
There is a lot of water on Mars and there once was a lot of surface flowing water. You don't see it because most of it is mixed with the soil which we call regolith on Mars, so the Martian soil can be anywhere from as little as 1% in some very dry desert, like areas to as much as 60% water. So, one strategy for getting water when you're on Mars is to break up the regolith, which would take something like a jackhammer because it's very cold, it's very frozen. If you can imagine making a frozen brick or a chunk of ice that's mostly soil and maybe half water and half soil, that's what you would be dealing with. So, you need to break this up. Put it in an oven. As it heats up it turns to steam. You run it through a distillation tube and you have pure drinking water that comes out the other end. There is a much easier way to get water on Mars. In this country we have developed industrial dehumidifiers, and they're very simple machines that simply blow the air in a room or a building across a mineral called zeolite. Zeolite is very common on Earth, it's very common on Mars. And zeolite is kind of like a sponge. It absorbs water like crazy. Takes the humidity right out of the air. Then you squeeze it and out comes the water.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
Thirdly, life from non-living matter. And this illustration often used is the one of the monkeys at the typewriter. Okay, so we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is basically if you leave chance and time long enough, you will get life. Don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange. Yes, it's wonderful. But leave enough matter, 600 million years on Earth, and you will have life. So the monkey's sitting at the typewriter, and the chances are eventually he produces the complete works of Shakespeare, so what's the problem? So there's no problem, there isn't an issue, right? You just leave him long enough, you'll be fine. And at one keystroke a second, the monkey might well eventually get to the complete works of Shakespeare, but he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So what I decided to do to run the numbers is instead of saying type the complete works of Shakespeare, I just ran the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing at one keystroke a second to type to be or not to be, that is the question. Right? On average, how long is it going to take my monkey friend at one keystroke a second? I don't know how long you think that would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth is supposed to have emerged within? And when I ran the numbers, to be or not to be, that is the question, takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase. And a DNA string, which you have to have for the life we have now, doesn't emerge is not like a sentence's worth of information. A DNA string has got as much information as the Encyclopedia Britannica. Right? So if we're saying that emerged, something of that complexity emerged by chance, undirected, within 600 million years, again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have, that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life is simply a question of saying, let there be, and there was.
We will do a demonstration to illustrate the difference between the thermodynamic control and the kinetic control of the product of a reaction. We will put a 0.05 molar solution of mercury 2 chloride in a beaker. We will add some 0.1 molar potassium iodide. We notice the formation of a reddish-orange solid. This solid is the product of thermodynamic control. It is the more stable product. We will now mix dilute solutions of mercury 2 chloride and potassium iodide. We see the formation of a yellow solid. This is the product of kinetic control. It is not the more stable product. Over time, the yellow product will undergo the reverse reaction and then eventually form the more stable product. The solution turns orange.
This is the first ocean deployment of two new high-precision instruments designed to monitor the Earth's signals from the seafloor. This housing contains the tiltmeter and nanobottom pressure recorder and the associated electronics and cabling used for power and communications. The instruments were deployed on the seafloor by a remotely operated vehicle as part of the Mars Seafloor Observatory testbed located at a depth of 3,000 feet in Monterey Bay. In this first test deployment in the ocean, they have already detected the ground motion from several large earthquakes, as far from the Mars site as Chile and the Mariana Trench. In the future, the instruments will be part of a global network of cabled seafloor observatories. Because of their precision, these two new instruments are already detecting signals which could never be measured before,